Starbucks made a noisy arrival in Vietnam in February 2013. The opening of its first shop in Ho Chi Minh City with hundreds of Vietnamese queuing up for their turn to buy a cup of coffee was reported by all business newspapers. Late July 2014, Starbucks opened its 3 coffee shops in prime locations in Hanoi. The U.S. cafe giant created the same Starbucks fever in the capital city of Vietnam. The question is, why hasn't this phenomenon happened to any Vietnamese brand? Stay tuned to know more. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Sharing Vietnam at 8:30 p.m. on VTC 10 Net Viet. Please join me in welcoming one of our favorite guests for the last few episodes of Sharing Vietnam, Jason Lusk.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's always great to be on your program.
On today's program, we are going to share with you another story concerning brand identity because recently, Starbucks have opened their shops here in Hanoi and they have created the same phenomenon of long queuing of young Vietnamese people waiting for their products. So that will be the story of Sharing Vietnam today. At first, what do you think about that phenomenon that happened last year in Ho Chi Minh City at first?
Well, I think that there's a lot of natural excitement about Starbucks coming to Vietnam. I think that there's another phenomenon here at play. 2 or 3 years ago, you didn't have Starbucks in Vietnam. You didn't have Burger King. You didn't have McDonald's. And I think that in some ways, ironically, the arrival of these companies here in Vietnam, these big global brands, is a symbol of Vietnam's emergence as a middle-income country and of the emergence of Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi as major global cities. So I think that there's a certain amount of pride and excitement that they're here. And far from it being a strange or threatening phenomenon that Vietnamese people would queue up to visit an American coffee shop, I think that in a way it's a form of showing some Vietnamese pride.
Some of the Hanoians, they did travel to Ho Chi Minh City. Some of them check in Starbucks in Ho Chi Minh City. What made them one more time queue for Starbucks here in Hanoi?
Look, nobody goes to Starbucks for the coffee. We all know that the coffee is just okay, and it's very expensive, right? They're coming for something else, and that something else that they're coming for is the brand experience of being at a Starbucks.
So is that a little bit like a short-term phenomenon that went passing away in a short time?
I think so. I think that it's important to differentiate the current excitement about Starbucks' arrival in Hanoi and the queuing around the block that we've seen from the long-term prospects of Starbucks in Hanoi. I don't think that Starbucks has the ability to or any desire to dominate the cafe scene in Vietnam. Vietnam has a rich, old coffee tradition that Starbucks I don't think has any interest in changing or overturning. What Starbucks has is a niche and a brand. What is that brand? That brand is all about inspiration and it's about familiarity. Starbucks always says that their brand means providing moments of inspiration to somebody every day, right? With the quality of their coffee, with the design of their cafes, and with the customer service that you receive when you visit a Starbucks. And that's always going to be appealing to a certain group of people, especially in a country like Vietnam, where that experience is very aspirational. It's very different from what you might get at another cafe. What Starbucks hopes to do is to carve out a niche for the people, the small percentage of Vietnamese, but enough to sustain their business, that are really interested in having that branded experience. The other piece of their brand is familiarity, right? The extraordinary thing about Starbucks and about Burger King and about McDonald's is that you can have the same experience at those restaurants here in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City that you might have in Chicago or London or the Bangkok airport. And that's very exciting. It's a way of vicarious travel, right? You can experience something of the outside world by visiting this cafe.
First of all, understanding the value of their brand image, understanding those elements that go into what makes a brand image, what helps to form a brand image in the marketplace. Their logotype, their brand format, their colors, all of these assets which they possess. And to think of them as assets, not just to think of them as decoration for their organization, but as real assets that they have helped form in the mind of their public over the years. Many Vietnamese firms in general now understand the value of branding, but there is still a lack of knowledge about what exactly is it that goes into forming a strong brand image in the marketplace.
Một cái thương hiệu thì nó phải căn cứ vào cái việc là người dân, người tiêu dùng, người ta có nhận thức về thương hiệu đấy không, người ta biết được cái thương hiệu đó không. Tiếp theo là người ta có những cái yếu tố khác, chẳng hạn như khi người ta biết được cái thương hiệu này rồi thì người ta có cân nhắc nó hay không. Và các cái yếu tố khác chẳng hạn như hình ảnh thương hiệu, rồi giá trị thương hiệu hay là những cái yếu tố khác nữa. Khách hàng người ta cảm nhận thế nào về cái thương hiệu này. Đúng không ạ? Thì chúng ta căn cứ vào những cái yếu tố như là cái lòng trung thành của khách hàng. Tức là khi người ta biết được như vậy rồi thì người ta có yêu sản phẩm của chúng ta không? Người ta có thích cái sản phẩm, cái thương hiệu của chúng ta không? Và người ta có giới thiệu cái thương hiệu của chúng ta cho người khác không? Và một cái điểm nữa trong cái chỉ số thương mại thương hiệu của Nelson đó phải căn cứ vào cái yếu tố người ta có sẵn sàng trả giá cao cho cái thương hiệu của chúng ta không?
There are a lot of success brand in Vietnam, we can say, but why haven't this phenomenon happened to other brand made in Vietnam?
First, we need to define what a brand is. I think at the most fundamental level, a brand is a promise. It's a promise that a company makes to you, the consumer, about what kind of experience you're going to have dealing with that company and that product. What makes Starbucks so extraordinarily successful is that their promise is very simple. That promise of inspiration and familiarity is very simple, and you see it reinforced in everything that they do. The way that they design their cafes, the customer service that they provide, the mood of their advertising, the style of their social media campaigns. Everything that they do reinforces that simple brand promise. I think that there are certain brands in Vietnam that get it, and I want to call out Vietjet. What does Vietjet promise? What's their brand promise? Well, Vietjet promises a convenient and economical flying experience with no frills and a little bit more fun. And they've been very good about reinforcing that message with things like the design of their planes and even the uniforms that they put their flight attendants in. The problem with branding is that the easiest way to kill a brand is to break your promise. And in the case of Vietjet, as we've seen recently with the plane that landed at Nha Trang instead of Dalat, for example, and some of the customer service issues that they've been having, is that they've kind of broken the promise to be a convenient flying experience, and their brand has suffered as a result. So yes, there are a few good examples of good branding in Vietnam, but where some of them fall apart is that they fail to deliver on the promise that they make through their brand. If I could raise one more thing that I think needs to be addressed in Vietnam in order for companies to be effective at branding, is that promise has to be very clear. I'm going to pick on a Vietnamese brand that I happen to like, but it's relevant to our conversation about Starbucks, and that's Trung Nguyen. I love Trung Nguyen coffee. I think that that's a wonderful company with a wonderful product, but I think that the brand is a mess, and I'll tell you why. It seems to me, based on my analysis of the Trung Nguyen brand, that they're about Vietnamese coffee and Vietnamese tea. Their promise, I think the promise they're trying to make is to bring the best of the Vietnamese cafe experience to the world, whether that world means inside Vietnam or outside Vietnam. But it gets confusing when you look at the design of their cafes, which doesn't seem very Vietnamese at all. It doesn't echo that brand promise. It seems the design of the cafes seems very Western, very modern. When you look at some of their advertising, I remember seeing a print advertisement for Trung Nguyen that had the face of Ernest Hemingway on it. What that has to do with Vietnam, I don't know. So there tends to be, with many Vietnamese brands, some confusion about exactly what the promise is, and they would benefit from a little more clarity and a little more focus.
When talking about brand, they're always talking about money and big investment. What do you think? Is there any chances for small and medium-sized enterprises or startup business to really have a good way on building their brand?
Branding starts with good analytical thinking, understanding what the brand promise is, and then applying creativity to bring that brand promise to life. It doesn't make any sense to build a fantastic brand if nobody knows about it. In order for a brand to be successful, it has to be promoted, and promotion costs money. The good news for small and medium-sized enterprises is that small and medium-sized enterprises tend to have small and medium-sized target audiences. And through social media and other tools, it's become easier and more cost-effective to target those small audiences in a way that's affordable to small businesses. I would also say that there is a great tool that's available to small and medium-sized enterprises that want to brand themselves more effectively. And this may be difficult medicine to swallow, but I'll say it anyway. That tool is customer service. The brand promise can and should say something about the experience that customer should expect to have when they call into your customer service line or when they're greeted by a shopping assistant at a store. That experience is something that a company has the power to control. It doesn't cost money, but it takes discipline. It's interesting, I asked a group of students recently if they could identify a Vietnamese brand that they thought was doing a really good job. The example that came up was a very strange one. They seemed to form some consensus. This was a group of students in Hanoi. They seemed to form consensus that the best brand that they knew was an electronics chain called Phuc Anh. When you buy a laptop at Phuc Anh, they will call you on the phone the next day to check in, to make sure that everything was okay, to ask how you're liking your purchase, and to talk through any problems that you might have had with that laptop. It's a small gesture. It doesn't take a lot of money, but that's the reason why this electronics store is growing so quickly and how it's managed to put itself head and shoulders above its competition.
So what would be your advice for small and medium-sized enterprises with small budget and just haven't had enough idea about branding yet, if they really want to start on that track?
Yes, I think the first step is to find that brand promise. Come up with a very simple idea. Starbucks has a 40-year history as a company. Over most of that 40-year period, they've had a very consistent brand promise. It hasn't changed. The tendency of marketers, especially marketers in startups, and by the way, I'm as guilty of this as anybody, is to look at a one-year history with a brand promise and say, well, that's not working, that's not getting any traction, and then to change it. And I will say that that brands tend to develop over time. Every time you change your brand messaging, you start over at day one. If you're a coffee chain, every time you change your brand promise, Starbucks is still 40 years ahead of you, right? And you're falling behind all the time. So be consistent and stick with that brand promise and find ways to make it work rather than making changes.
So once again, thank you so much, Jason, for being with us and sharing with us your expert knowledge. And we hope that in the future you will have a long journey in Vietnam.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you very much.
That's all we have for today's program. Thank you so much for watching Sharing Vietnam at 8:30 p.m. on VTC 10 Net Việt. Send an email to sharingvietnam@vtc.vn. Leave you for today and see you next time.